Greetings, Professor McKee here with a new video series, Seminar Saturdays. In this series, I will present a recent academic paper in finance. This will be somewhat similar to the most enjoyable parts of grad school, which is a seminar class where the faculty member assigns interesting papers, and you present and discuss the papers with your fellow students and the instructor. I'll be doing the presenting, but sadly our discussion will have to be in the comments section. Hopefully there will be some discussion. As my area of expertise is mainly empirical corporate finance, I'll be focusing on empirical papers, usually in corporate finance. These papers will be recently published at top journals or been accepted at a top conference, so they're typically going to be pretty good papers. For a particularly interesting paper, I may go further back into the past. After all, just because it's old doesn't mean it's not good. And as this is not an actual PhD seminar, I will both try to pick empirical settings that are more of general interest, because there's a lot of cool things that happen in finance that we use in empirical papers, and also explain in more detail the finance theory that motivates our empirical analysis. In an actual seminar, the PhD students and the professors are at a pretty high level of knowledge so that they don't need as much background information. Each Saturday during the academic year, I will be releasing my presentation of the chosen paper. If I am able, I may continue to do papers over the summer. That will depend on how much backlog I'm able to build up during the year. Requests for papers to present are most welcome, and comments on the papers on the video are, of course, welcome as too. All right, greetings and welcome to the very first Seminar Saturday. This week's topic is on risk shifting. Our paper today is called Risk Shifting in Corporate Pension Plans, Evidence from a Natural Experiment by, before I say the name, a preemptive apology. I do not have a pronunciation guide for the author, so if I mangle your name, David, I'm really sorry. So by David Pedersen, published in Journal of Financial and Quantitative Analysis, 2019. So a few introductory notes here. This is a solo paper. This is rare. Most papers have multiple authors. Somewhere between 2 to 5 authors is pretty common. Often if you see one, it is a job market paper as part of the person's thesis. However, in this paper, he doesn't mention any seminars in his acknowledgments. So either he didn't give any flyouts where you present your job market paper, which is pretty unlikely, or it wasn't actually his job market paper and it was a rare solo author paper. It was published in JFQA. That is the 4th best journal in our field. Basically, it's a half a step below the top 3 journals. So probably he submitted a top 3 journals, was rejected, and then went here. It's not actually the most influential, based on what journal it published in, for risk shifting, but I think the empirical setting here is more interesting and more intuitive than the paper I'm thinking of. I will include some links to several other papers that have tried to find risk shifting empirically in finance in my video description. The ones not published by me are ones published in top journals. Mine was not published in a top journal, but I did publish a paper here, so I feel like it's acceptable for me to include it along with those papers. It is a very short paper. It's only 17 pages long, and that's including its tables, including reference pages. And this is really nice to see because a lot of times we get papers that are gigantic monstrosities with 90 pages and a bunch of appendices, and it just gets super bloated with all these additional tests. And I understand why referees want all these extra tests for robustness and to make sure it's what they find is actually true. But a paper that really is laser focused and concise on the actual research question is nice to see too. It makes it a lot easier to read. If you want to read this yourself, it's not that long to read because it's only 17 pages, and really it's more like 15 or 14, given that several pages are eaten up by the abstract and the reference page and various tables. Okay, so let's get into risk shifting. What is risk shifting? I'm going to get into a little more detail than I probably would if it was an actual PhD seminar, because I'm assuming most people here are not PhD students. So risk shifting is a theory from economics. And the theory is about decisions we make, because every decision we make is going to have some potential reward and some potential risk. And when we are weighing if we want to make this decision or not, we weigh the reward, we weigh the risk, the likelihood of these things happening, and if the reward is higher than the risk, we'll probably do it. If it's not, we probably won't do it. What happens with risk shifting is that the risk and reward probabilities haven't changed. All that risk-reward trade-off consideration is the actual underlying risks and rewards are not any different. But who takes on the risk does change. I will still get the reward, but I no longer bear the cost of risk. So naturally, I have a much stronger incentive to do riskier things because there's a risk-reward trade-off. Usually high-risk things tend to be higher reward. I get the higher reward, but I don't pay the cost for it. Now, this is something that shows up in a lot of places, even though we might not call it risk shifting because we're not economics or finance professors, because it appears in most competitive sports and games. So I'm going to go through in one example in a sport that is mildly popular down here in Texas, using football. So let's say we have a football team. Our team is down by 6 points. They're 40 yards from the end zone. There's only a couple seconds left on the clock. They have one offensive play that they can run. The play they're going to run is the Hail Mary play. Now, if you're not familiar, the Hail Mary play, they send all their receivers into the end zone. The quarterback then throws the ball, prays a Hail Mary while the ball's in the air, because this is a very high-risk play, and hopes that one of his players catches the ball in the end zone, they score a touchdown, and not that the other team gets an interception. Now, this is a very risky play. In a normal circumstance, the football team's never going to run this play. Because, yeah, touchdown's nice, but the very high risk of interception and losing control of the football is way too high to make it worth it. But why are they doing it in this particular situation? Because if it works, they win the game. They score 6 points, they then get kick in the point after attempt, and they go ahead and win. And if it fails, well, the other team would get a chance to score, except time's already going to run out, and if it fails, they were already going to lose. They don't care about failing. Failing doesn't hurt them, because they were already going to lose. And a normal play that had less risk would never be able to score 40 yards to get them the touchdown. So the risk doesn't matter to them, and the reward is the only way they can win. In most sports and games, various competitive sports, card games, board games, the margin of defeat doesn't matter. So if I lose by 1 point in a football game, or if I lose by 20 points, no one really cares. What matters is I lost. Losing by more doesn't really hurt you very much. It very, very rarely is going to penalize you because you lost by a higher amount. So near the end of the game, when you're losing with not much time left, players have an incentive to go for riskier moves because the cost of failure on that risky move no longer hurts them. And they lose by more, but losing by more isn't a big deal. So just a couple more examples. Basketball, half-court shot. Very risky, very unlikely that you'll score points with that. And normally the other team would get the ball and then they can try to score. But if time's running out, the cost of failure no longer hurts you because you're not the other team's not going to have a chance to score when you miss, because you are going to miss probably. Empty net in hockey. When time is running out, teams will often pull their goalie to get an extra skater on the ice who can put more offensive pressure on the team, try and score a goal. The reason you do that is, well, you need to score a goal before time runs out. There's a huge risk here. You don't have anyone guarding your net, so an empty net goal is very likely. But you were already losing. Losing by 2 goals versus 1, no one cares. So you have an incentive to take that riskier action because the cost of failure is no longer penalizing you. Well, let's bring it over to finance. See, corporations, whether they're public or private, have limited liability. So let's say our corporation is being restructured or it's being liquidated in bankruptcy. The creditors cannot seize my personal assets. My house, my car, my retirement accounts, my checking account. Any personal asset of an owner of that company that's in bankruptcy is safe. Creditors can only seize assets of the company during bankruptcy. Now, owners are still losing. They lose their entire investment in the company because owners are last in line. So after everyone else's liabilities have been met, then the owners get what's left. If you're in bankruptcy, that means there's not enough money to go around. And if you're last, you're getting nothing. But you are bounded. You can't lose more than your entire investment. Another easier way, perhaps, to think about it is that look at a stock price for a company. Stock prices can't go to negative. They can go to 0. That's what's going to happen in bankruptcy. But they can't go below 0. So let's think about what happens for the owners of the company during bankruptcy. Say we have liabilities greater than assets, which is what's going to happen in bankruptcy. Owners lose their entire investment. But what if liabilities is much greater than assets? So it's 1 million more or 1 billion more. Well, to the owners, it doesn't matter. They still lose their entire investment. The amount of loss that they experience is exactly the same, whether it's a million shortfall or it's a billion shortfall. So just like a football team, the margin of defeat doesn't matter to the owners of corporations. They still lose, so they don't like losing, of course, but losing by a lot or losing by a little doesn't hurt them any differently. So they have an incentive to risk shift because if a company is close to bankruptcy, their best play is to make risky investments. If the investments work, the rewards might be enough to escape bankruptcy. If the investments fail, the company is deeper in a hole, but the owners had already lost almost all their value. They don't lose very much. And the excess loss gets eaten by other people who are ahead of them in line during bankruptcy, so the bank. The creditors eat those additional losses, not the owners. So this is, the investments that the company is making haven't changed. They can make the same investments, and it's the same risk-reward trade-off that they're choosing based on, but they keep the reward. They don't deal with the risk very much. Most of the risk goes away because someone else has to absorb that cost if the investment fails. Okay, so that is our theory, and our theory predicts companies close to bankruptcy will make riskier investments. Now, the empirical question here is, do they actually do this? We have a theoretical prediction. An obvious good topic for a paper is take that theoretical prediction and go out and test it. See if companies are actually doing this thing that we think they should be doing. So, we are going to go out. We're going to try to find risk shifting out in the wild. And there's some reason to think that maybe we won't actually find this. Because there's some people who really don't want risk shifting to happen. The bank doesn't want risk shifting to happen because the bank's the one that takes on that risk, and they don't get the reward. So it's a really, really bad deal for them. They have a strong incentive to prevent risk shifting if they can. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. Open question. There could be other things too. For instance, the CEO, the guy in charge of running the company. He's the one that implements these riskier investments, but he's not the shareholders. He might prefer not to go big or go home with these risky investments because it's better for him to not do that. Agency conflicts could be something that also prevents risk shifting from happening. So another issue we're going to encounter, which this paper can deal with pretty easily, but if we're just looking at investments in general, how do we know it's riskier? How are we measuring risk? That's how we know it's riskier. Does this even count as an investment? Our initial question here is, oh, we need risky investments, but there's going to be challenges implementing the empirical test. That's what makes papers interesting. So we have this challenge here, defining risk, measuring risk, what counts as the investment. Our other problem is that the indogeneity police will be on our case. So let's say we have a distressed firm. We have a good definition for risk and investments. We run a regression. We find that there's a positive relationship between distress and risky investments. So we're done. We've solved the question. The answer is yes. Well, actually, no. We have not solved the question because we don't know that distress caused the higher risk investments. All we know is that there's a correlation. It is possible that something else caused both the risky investments and the distress, and that is why we see the correlation. For instance, maybe our CEO is overconfident. He routinely looks at an investment and thinks that the risk is less than it actually is. He's bad at judging this investment. And so he keeps making bad investments. The company gets in trouble, and then he's still in charge, so he's still making bad investments even after the company's in trouble. So the potential omitted variable, which is the formal econometric problem here, is we have a bad CEO, and he is causing both high-risk investments and the distress. So it wasn't risk shifting that caused the high-risk investments. There's potentially other omitted variables that could cause things too. It's really hard to fully rule out every possible omitted variable. There's so many possible things. And even if we know some omitted variables, we might not have good measurements for the thing we know could be a problem, right? Like, how do we measure CEO overconfidence? Well, there's actually a paper an interesting paper that does do that, but maybe we don't believe the paper, or maybe it's something else, and we don't have a good way to really get at this intangible thing. And I quite possibly will cover that paper that goes into how to measure overconfidence at some other week. So our solution is that we need to find some way to show causality, and just accounting for all possible omitted variables isn't going to work. Every empirical paper faces this challenge. If you're trying to publish a paper in finance, in economics, and accounting sometime within the last 20 years or so, it is effectively impossible unless you have some strategy to show causality. Now, ideally, we could just randomly force some companies into distress, see how they respond, compare them with companies that weren't forced into distress. But we can't really do that to publicly traded companies. We don't have the capacity to do it, and in many cases it would also be unethical. But more importantly, it's not possible, even if we didn't have an ethical problem. So what finance papers and a lot of economics and accounting too are going to do is we're going to take a quasi-natural experiment. We're going to use a couple different econometric techniques to identify causality. Empirical papers always have to have an identification strategy. The only way you could maybe get away with not doing this and have some sort of descriptive or correlation instead of causality is if you are super famous in the field, or you have an extremely novel data set or question. If you're wondering if you're famous or have a novel data set or question, well, then that means you're not. Okay, this is not easy, and it's the window for doing that is always very, very narrow. So what we need, because we can't randomly force firms into distress, is some plausibly random increase or decrease, but it's probably going to be increase of distress for some firms. And then we compare them to firms that weren't pushed towards distress. So we're going to walk through Pedersen's natural experiment here. So he relies on a sudden increase in liability risk. This was a setting previously used by Gormley and Matsa in 2011. This was published in a top 3 journal. In one sense, this is good, because there were some referees at a top journal who thought this was a reasonable identification strategy. So probably if you're trying to publish now, also using the same thing, those referees are going to continue to think it's a good identification strategy. Less good is that the more often a setting gets used, the more likely we're going to find false positives. So let's say, because we're at the 5% statistical significance level, typically, there's around, roughly speaking, and it's not exactly statistically correct, there's about a 5% chance that we're going to get false positive. Again, I know it's not exactly correct. You don't need to correct me in the comments. And so let's say we have 20 papers that are all using the same setting. Pretty good odds that somebody found a false positive. We don't know which one. Could be even more than one, potentially. But we don't know for sure that it worked. Now, this is only the second time that someone has used it, as far as I'm aware. So the multiple testing concern is a little bit limited here, but it is a significant problem for us in finance. There's only so many cool natural experiments that happen in finance, and so every time we find one, what you usually see is a bunch of authors all pile in trying to use this natural experiment to answer some research question that they want to answer. And it's sort of inevitable because we have to have these natural experiments, and they're a scarce resource. But it does create this multiple testing problem. At least in this case, it's not a super overused identification strategy, so we're probably fine. Maybe you don't agree with me that they're probably okay, but that'll be my assessment. Okay, so he first goes to the National Occupational Exposure Survey, NOES, and this was a survey that conducted on-site visits of almost 4,500 firms between 1981 and 1983. It recorded chemical, physical, and biological agents that the workers were being exposed to during their employment at those 4,500 firms. It recorded 13,000 different agents, including, this is going to be critical for us, including agents that were not known to be hazardous at that time. So they're trying to capture everything. All possible exposures that firm workers are being exposed to because they're working at this company. Next, he has the Health and Human Services National Toxicology Program that releases a report on carcinogens, so agents that are basically causing cancer. And these reports are periodically issued where they're adding additional agents to it. Oh, we discovered this thing causes cancer, so now we're putting this new agent on our report. The third report was in 1983, which, kind of note, 1983 was when our survey ends. This is when the same year. And then the 11th report, the last one he's using, is in 2004. So reports 4 through 10 are, of course, in between, in that intervening roughly 20 years. So, the intuition here. What happens if a new chemical, new agent is added to this list of carcinogens and we have prior exposure to it through workers? And we're going to measure that through that nose survey. Well, what's going to happen? Lawsuits. Lots and lots of lawsuits. Very unfun, expensive times for the companies if they had workers exposed to those newly added chemicals. Companies that did not have exposed workers are not going to care. It doesn't matter to them because there's no liability risk they're going to face because their workers are not exposed. And you can kind of see, hopefully, why this would be relevant for the company, right? Because say I'm a court and plaintiffs come in and say, hey, my clients have all these health issues because they were workers exposed to these chemicals, and this company needs to pay money to indemnify these workers for the health problems they're experiencing. And the company will be like, well, you're claiming that they're caused by these chemicals, but you have no third-party independent determination that these chemicals were actually causing the health problems. Well, now that the chemical gets added to this official government list, the plaintiffs have a much stronger argument. Kind of the platonic ideal for this identification strategy is asbestos. Now, I'm not sure if asbestos is actually included in this carcinogen list here, but there were a ton of lawsuits, very, very expensive lawsuits for companies because their workers were exposed to asbestos and then had health problems later in life. And, companies were certainly pushed closer, very close to bankruptcy, if not into bankruptcy, because of those expensive lawsuits. And so that's the kind of the idea. These lawsuits are expensive, and suddenly we have a big increase in liability risk. We're much closer to bankruptcy now, purely because those carcinogens got added to this list. So a few key features here that make this work pretty well. Companies are not going to know about this liability risk until the chemical gets added. The liability risk doesn't exist, and then suddenly, boom, you have a big increase. Importantly, their liability risk now was caused by a decision they made years ago, decades ago, back in the 1980s. They chose to use that particular chemical in this particular production process. It's kind of hard to come up with something that's going to cause both the choice to use this chemical 20 years ago and their risky investments that they're making today. Beyond, risk shifting. That's a particularly nice feature here where, because of the gap in time, it makes it much harder for referees or me to come up with omitted variables that are causing both things, because how are you supposed to cause something that happened 20 years ago and something that happened today beyond the risk shifting explanation? That's a lot harder. So this length of time makes this identification strategy quite good. Also, asbestos, liability lawsuits, that's a pretty interesting sort of shock to these companies, not a typical one that you see. So let's talk about how we define our control and treated firms. He has a 4-digit SIC industry code for companies, and the nose survey is where he's getting that. And so if the nose survey says more than 7.5% of workers are exposed to the chemical, then all firms in that industry are considered treated. Now, whenever you see a cutoff like this 7.5%, you've got to be careful, especially if you're sort of in referee nitpicking kind of mode. Because why did he choose 7.5%? What would have happened if he picked 7% or 8%? Would he still get the same results? Now, he justifies 7.5% by saying, hey, look, Gormley Matsa, the first guys who did this, they picked 7.5%, so I pick it too. It's good to have a pre-existing reason like that, to justify why you pick this particular number, because otherwise maybe you're p-hacking and just picking a number that works for you. And a number like this also is sort of sensible, because if you could increase it, right? You could say, well, maybe it's 10% or 20% or 30%. But the problem there is you might not have enough companies that had workers exposed to the chemical in that high proportion. So you might run out of companies that are treated, and then you can't really find anything because there's no treated firms. If you make the percentage too low, then maybe the exposure risk from the liability gets so small that the companies are not worried. They're not actually being treated anymore. But anyways, that's 7.5%. I'm just sort of flagging that because, hey, when you see cutoffs like that, you want to be careful. That's the kind of thing where a referee would probably say, hey, what about 7%? What about 8%? Add a robustness table where you show those alternatives and specifications. I'm a little surprised no one did it. I suppose his justification of Gormley Matsa did it in 2011 is enough for the referee. Control firms are firms that are in the same Fama French 48 industry as a treated firm, but they're not in the same 4-digit SIC code. So the Fama French industry classifications take the SIC codes and sort of group them. So you might have 10 4-digit SIC codes in a single one out of the 48 Fama French industries. So if you're in the same code as the NOS survey that says you're exposed to this chemical, you're treated. The other ones, say there's 10, so you have 9 that are not treated with this chemical exposure. Those are your control firms. So the idea here is that our control firms are in similar industries, very similar industries, but they're not exactly the same, but they're very close. He has a table 1 which compares his treated and control firms. And so the ideal outcome for him here is that they're different from each other. They're not different because you want them to look the same before they are treated. This is to improve confidence in his natural experiment. If everyone 100% believed his identification strategy, you wouldn't need table 1. Because it wouldn't matter if the randomly selected treated firms are a little bit different from control firms. After all, they're randomly selected. It's just pure chance. But realistically, no one ever fully trusts the identification strategy. So you need to include things like table 1, which I'm not showing, to sort of shore up our confidence in the identification of causality. One thing I'll note here is he clusters T-stats by industry. Now, clustering is pretty normal, extremely normal for your kind of main regression. Clustering your T-stats for a summary table comparing treated and controlled firms is a little bit unusual. I don't see it in a ton of places. It's not a crazy decision because if you're in the same Fama French industry, you're probably related to each other. And if you're in the same 4-digit SIC industry, you are extremely similar to different firms. So clustering on a kind of an econometric basis makes sense there. It does make it harder for him to find statistical differences between his treated and controlled firms, which is what he wants. But it's reasonable to do it like this. It's just a lot of times people don't do it. And you have to wonder, well, if he didn't cluster, would he find more differences between treated and controlled firms? I don't know. Maybe he would. Okay, how does he define risky investments? Well, he focuses on pension plans. There was a bit of a spoiler in the title. That's what we're looking at. And the idea with defined benefit pension plans is you can shift risk onto the pension plan. Because if the company goes bankrupt, assets under the pension's control are safe. They can't be taken. So they will always go to support the promised benefits that the pensioners are supposed to receive. But if there are insufficient assets under the pension's control, then the pension is just one creditor among many fighting it out with all the other creditors trying to get enough assets to make good all the promises the pensions make. Now there is the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corp, PBGC, that provides insurance in case the pension doesn't have full funding when the company goes bankrupt, but there is a limit on how much benefit the PBGC provides. So if you're underfunded and your benefit amount is above that PBGC maximum, you as a pensioner, you lose out. So a company can underfund their pension, put less money in than is needed to pay for the benefits today. I mean, eventually they'd have to put money in, but they don't need. But that can be 20 years ago, 20 years from now, 30 years, 40 years, depends on when the people retire and start taking their benefits. And then that cash can be used for investment instead. It's effectively shifting risk onto the pension, a specific creditor of the company. Another way you could do this is you take the pension, you direct the pension, invest in riskier assets, which will typically have higher returns because there's a risk-reward trade-off. And then that would allow the company to contribute less, and the pension stays actuarial solvent. Because the actuary will say, okay, we have an estimate for our average return over the next 30 years. So our cash today is going to grow. And then if it's growing at a higher interest rate, it's going to grow to be a bigger number. And that bigger number will then allow the company to put less cash into the pension today. He doesn't actually look at the riskiness of the pension's investments. He's looking at just underfunding, period. So while the debt owed to the pension fund it looks different from a bank loan or corporate bond, it's still effectively a debt. And logically, the risk shifting incentives are still going to apply here. Because if the pension is lacking assets in bankruptcy, well, it doesn't really hurt the shareholders. Shareholders will benefit if they can shift that risk onto the pensioners, just as much as if they shift the risk onto the bank or the bondholders or whoever else has a claim on the company. So Pedersen takes the NOS survey, which includes the 4-digit SIC and the list of agents. It links the survey to the carcinogen report, so using agents. So chemical is listed in NOS survey. Chemical is also listed in carcinogen report. There we got our link. And then the SIC industry codes are able to then link those to CompuStat, which provides all the regular financial information for companies, provides information on pension funding. So carcinogens link NOS and the carcinogen report. Industry links CompuStat and the NOS survey. Okay, ready for the results. He's going to run a regression where he has a treated firm and he sees, does the treated firm underfund pensions more or do they not? And what he finds is nothing. So exposure means you were exposed to the liability risk. 1 means you have exposure, 0 means nothing. If you have exposure to the liability risk, your pension underfunding goes down by 0.006. It's effectively 0. Our T-stat here is 0.02. You would need something around 2 or higher, preferably a little bit higher than 2, to get actual statistical significance. He tries it just pension underfunding in general. He tries scaling it to the assets of the company. It's dead. Now, interesting thing here is he found a null result. He found no pension underfunding. It's really hard to publish a null result. Editors don't like publishing null results because null results are boring. But both null results are important. If we don't find anything when theory says we should find something, that is knowing that is good increase in knowledge for us. So good on JFQA for publishing this, even though it was no result. I applaud the editors, the editor, whoever signed off on this publication. Keep doing it. Publishing null results is good for the field. It makes it better for everyone if we know that this does not work. Because what we don't want to have happen is Pedersen tries this, he gets a null result and says, well, I can't publish it. So he just tosses the results, and then I come along and I try the same thing and I don't find anything, and I toss it. And a bunch of researchers are all researching the same thing, and no one realizes that everyone's already tried it and gotten no results because it never got published. Okay, so that is our main result. Nothing happens. No risk shifting is going on, at least for pensions. Now, that this doesn't mean risk shifting doesn't happen. After all, we're never fully confident in our natural experiment. There could be flaws with it. Even though we think it's pretty good, nothing's perfect. So to have real confidence that yes, risk shifting doesn't happen for pensions or doesn't happen at all, what I would at least would prefer to see is saying, let's have it published like 5 times. 5 different settings, 5 different approaches for identification, and they all don't find risk shifting. Then I'd be a lot more confident, yes, risk shifting doesn't happen. If instead we have 5 that all find it does happen, that would improve confidence the other direction. So for further confirmation, Pedersen does what I call triangulation. There's a few other terms for it, but that's just the term my advisor used, so that's what I use. So he's splitting the firms by characteristics that should strengthen or weaken the results. Now, it's important to note, we are outside our natural experiment. There's no random change in these characteristics for the firm, like there is for liability risk. So we could have lots of endogeneity issues with omitted variable bias and so on and so forth, but these aren't the main results. If you don't believe one of these columns, one of these tables, that's probably not going to make or break the paper. What makes or breaks the paper is if you believe this table. If you believe this table, then you believe the paper. If you don't, you don't believe the paper, and probably his triangulation tables are not going to too much, but kind of move things a little bit on the margin. So, what does he look at? Well, he first looks at high bankruptcy risk. He's measuring it using the Altman Z, which is a very old measure, more than 50 years old, that tries to predict bankruptcy for companies. Because of how old it is, there is some endogeneity issues with Altman Z. I'm a little surprised he was able to use it, because you don't see it used all that much anymore, since there's potential problems with it. But the idea here is if you have higher risk of bankruptcy, in addition to this shock to your liability risk, your risk shifting incentive is bigger because you're close. You were already in a shaky position, and now you get whacked with this extra liability risk. Now you're really close to bankruptcy, and so you have a really big risk shifting incentive. He also looks at high leverage, low cash flow, low size. So if you had a lot of pre-existing debt, that's what high leverage means. Again, you're more vulnerable. If you have low cash flow, so up until now, the income coming into you, which is cash you could use to, say, deal with your liability risk, is low. It's going to be hard for you to deal with this big shock of liability risk. If you're a small company, well, relatively speaking, because these are all publicly traded companies, so they're all really big. If you're relatively small, we know that you are going to have a hard time accessing credit markets compared to larger companies. And that's going to make you more vulnerable because you're going to have a harder time raising cash to deal with this liability risk. So these should all also increase your risk shifting incentive. One thing to kind of note here, he's not really looking at 4 completely independent variables here. leverage, cash flow, size are all part of the Altman Z formula. So they're all going to be correlated with Altman Z. He also looks at dividend payments. So if you have no dividend payments, so before this liability shock, you didn't pay dividends. Well, if you were paying dividends, you can cut them. That's a discretionary cash outflow that you can get rid of if you need to. Now, most companies don't like doing it, but if it's an emergency, better to cut the dividends than go through bankruptcy. But if you don't have dividends, your emergency source is now unavailable. And again, this is not 100% independent. If you have no dividend payments, that's because you don't have cash flow. If you have cash flow, you might pay dividends, but if you don't have cash, you can't. You just literally can't pay dividends. So again, it's probably correlated with these as well. And then he also uses a financial constraint measure. So this is similar kind of idea here. If you're already financially constrained and you have a hard time raising money from capital markets, this shock is going to be worse for you. And he's using an estimate from a Whited Wu paper from 2010 that uses structural estimation. Whited is really famous for doing structural estimation. She has a ton of papers where she does structural estimation. And her students and her have papers together doing structural estimation. He also uses a Hadlock Pierce measure, another 2010 paper, that also has a financial constraint measure. He doesn't show those results, but he says they're the same as using Whited Wu. And the idea here is pretty similar to like the small size. I have not looked at the Whited Wu paper in great detail or the Hadlock Pierce paper. My guess would be firm size is something that shows up in their structural estimation. Because if you're smaller, you have a harder time raising money, which makes you constrained. But that's the last measure he uses, and I will provide links to both the Whited Wu paper and the Hadlock Pierce paper in the video description. So all these things should increase risk shifting. That's the first row here. High bankruptcy, high leverage, low cash flow, zero dividends, small firms, and financially constrained firms. And just like his regular results, he finds nothing. No change. So even with companies that should have a bigger increase in their risk shifting incentive, they're still not doing it. They're still not underfunding pensions. He looks at low bankruptcy risk, low leverage, high cash flow, has dividends, is large, is unconstrained, and he doesn't find anything here either. So it doesn't seem to matter if they have these pre-existing conditions that should make them more interested in risk shifting, they still don't do it. And then his second triangulation is looking at agency conflicts. Because one thing I mentioned was, hey, maybe there's agency conflicts that the CEO doesn't want to do the risk shifting, and then that's why risk shifting doesn't happen. Because what's good for shareholders might not be good for the CEO, and this is a huge topic in finance. It might be better for the CEO's career to fail gracefully rather than to go big or go home. Maybe the banks will reward the CEO for not screwing them over with risk shifting right before bankruptcy happens. Or maybe the CEO will get punished less for the failure if it's a close call versus it's a complete train wreck of a bankruptcy. So what he does is he first looks at sort of CEO personal wealth exposure. So CEO exposure to VIGA. And VIGA comes from options, derivatives here. And the higher your VIGA is, the more you have increase in value when the underlying asset increases in volatility. So if you pay the CEO in options, call options, then the CEO pay will increase as the volatility of the share price of the stock goes up. And the more VIGA the CEO has, the higher his increase in pay goes with each unit increase in volatility. So risk shifting will probably increase volatility of the underlying stock price asset. And so if the CEO has high VIGA, he personally benefits from risk shifting. Note here, this isn't because shareholders benefit. any increase in risk would be good for the CEO. Next, he looks at exposure to vega and low exposure to delta. So I've already explained vega. Delta is a different measure from financial derivatives options. And delta is your increase in value when the price of the underlying asset goes up. So again, if the CEO is paid in either stock or in options to buy the stock, as the underlying asset goes up, CEO pay goes up. So if he has high delta, the CEO is highly aligned with the shareholders. If he has low delta, he's less aligned. And I'm not sure why he's doing high vega and low delta. The logic here doesn't fully make sense to me. He does say this is based on a previous paper's definition, so maybe that's why he's including it. But it seems like if you're at high vega, you benefit from more risk. If you're at high delta, if risk shifting is right and it benefits shareholders, that it's going to make stock price go up. High delta would probably work to increase risk shifting, and therefore low delta would make risk shifting less likely. Since I've worked with this data myself when I was doing risk shifting, my own risk shifting paper, you're splitting the sample twice, right? You split it by vega, and then you split it again by delta. So you're cutting it into quarters instead of halves, or you're slicing it in twice instead of once. And if you slice the data too much, you can get problems where you don't have enough observations to actually do anything. And it gets close to that point when you're working with CEO exposure to V and delta, because the data there is not super great. And then he also looks at CEOs receiving benefits from pensions, the pension that's potentially going to be underfunded. Obviously, if the CEO is going to receive pension benefits and then he screws over the pension, he's screwing over his own pension benefit. So he would have a less incentive to risk shift, in particular for the pension. Now, he might want to risk shift someone else because he's not hurt there, but he's personally hurt with the pension. And there's a problem here, which is that CEOs don't really receive much value from pensions. These pensions are qualified plan type pensions. I actually teach an entire class on all the tax rules for pensions, other types of qualified plans, and there's a cap. So if you make $300,000 or less, roughly, all of your income will count towards increasing your retirement benefit. But once you get above that cap, which is around $300,000, extra dollars of income don't actually increase your pension benefit. So if the CEO makes $1 million, he can get a benefit the same as someone who made $300,000, but he doesn't get more than that person. So usually CEOs receive benefits, most of their retirement benefits, through other means, not through the qualified plan that everyone else participates in, because the CEO pays a lot higher than $300,000. So I'm sure there's some CEOs who are part of the qualified plan, but I doubt that they actually get hurt very much if the pension plan just completely goes to zero, because they're getting so much pay other ways. Pedersen does note that he added this because of a referee request, so this wasn't originally in the paper. Referee wanted to add it. Again, I'm not super convinced this is really the best way to do it, or even important to do this, but it's just a triangulation table, so you might as well throw it in, especially if the referee says to do it, because the referee tells you to do something, you better do it or you're not going to get published. He also looks at corporate governance. So if we have better corporate governance, if our shareholders have more power, then there's going to be fewer agency conflicts, because they can prevent the CEO from not doing the things they want them to do. If shareholders do not have power, then the CEO has power, and the CEO can just ignore what the shareholders want and do what benefits the CEO. So the two things he looks at are strong governance based on the non-existence of anti-takeover provisions, specifically poison pills and staggered boards. The idea being that if the CEO is entrenched and it's hard to take over the company because of poison pills, staggered boards, I'll get to those, how those work in a second. The idea is then one of the ways you discipline a CEO for doing a bad job is share price goes down, an outside company or investors come in, they buy the company. When the company gets acquired, the CEO then gets fired, and a new CEO is put in place. So if you have anti-takeover provisions that prevent acquisition, then one mechanism to punish the CEO for not doing a good job has been removed. And that makes the CEO it makes the CEO more able to do things that benefit the CEO versus benefiting shareholders. Now, poison pills are basically kind of like a suicide pill. So the corporation can take actions that are very damaging to the company and basically destroy value. And specifically, it's usually that they can issue a ton of new shares to all the other shareholders, not the shareholder that's trying to do the hostile takeover, and that'll prevent the takeover. Staggered boards are how you elect the board of directors, because board of directors have to approve a major thing like an acquisition. And if you stagger the elections of the board, then even if some activist shareholder comes in, wins elections, he's not going to be able to replace everyone on the board. He just replaces some people. So it's kind of like the U.S. Senate, right? There's staggered elections every 2 years. About a third of the senators are up for election. So even if you win one election and replace all the senators, you've only replaced 1/3 of the current people. They're also called classified boards because there's a class that's up for election each cycle. If you remove the staggered board and you have just everyone all elected all at once, it's like House of Representatives. Every 2 years, everyone is potentially replaced. Now, this is a classic definition for corporate governance, not having these things. There is significant debate right now in the literature on if this actually is measuring corporate governance at all, because it's pretty easy to add poison pills if you need to. And it's not really clear if staggering your board really prevents hostile takeovers at all. And quite possibly I will cover a paper or two in this debate during seminar Saturdays. But just kind of note, like, this is not a super rock solid corporate governance measure anymore. Now, it used to be. Removing staggered boards is something that has happened a lot in the past few decades, in large part because there's some influential finance researchers who think and have published papers arguing that staggered boards are bad for corporate governance. And so there's a lot of pressure on companies, or have been a lot of pressure in recent history, to remove staggered boards. So that's his first measure, and I've digressed probably far too much on that. Now, institutional ownership. The idea here is that if you have lots of institutional investors, these are big guys, these are investment banks, Goldman Sachs, hedge funds, etc. They have lots of time and resources to scrutinize what the manager is doing, and they can control the manager better than you or me. Retail guys, we're busy with our own jobs. We don't have time to peer over the CEO's shoulder and see what he's doing. So if you have high institutional ownership, that means that you have more institutional investors who care about how the company is being managed. They're going to impose more constraints, do a better job monitoring the CEO, the more of them we have. So high institutional ownership is high governance, so low institutional ownership is low governance. Okay, so the first two are high governance, so the non-anti-takeover provisions, the high institutional ownership, and then these three are CEO has benefits from the risk shifting, or is not harmed by the risk shifting in the case of the pension exposure. And what he finds is, once again, Nothing. No underfunding and depensions are happening. It's all just pretty much flat at zero. Whether you have good governance or low governance, whether you have high exposure or low exposure to the risk shifting part. And just kind of note the observations here, right? So if I have high vega, low delta, there is a big drop in observations. I go from 1,700 to 800. When I look at high institutional ownership, he has 5,000 observations. The number of firms drops a lot as well. He's only 45, 50 firms in each group. I encountered that problem myself when I worked with high vega, high delta, low delta, and it's partially because of the data source he's using. CEO pay is more sparse than institutional ownership, but it's also because he's slicing twice. He has high vega and he also has low delta. Okay, and then the last thing I want to note here for these two triangulation tables is you're splitting by governance, you're splitting by institutional ownership. There's a lot of choices being made here about how to do it. You could do top 50% vega, bottom 50% vega. You could do top 25% versus bottom 75%. You could do top 75% versus bottom 25%. You could do top 1/3 versus bottom 1/3 and just cut out the middle third. You could do quintiles. There's a lot of choices that the authors, in this case author, can make on how to slice these triangulation tables. And so it's really easy for them to p-hack. And frankly, there's not really a good pre-existing theoretical reason for why you should pick median versus thirds versus 25% tiles versus quintiles and all that stuff. So again, if this triangulation is making or breaking the paper, that's bad. Because there's a lot of things that are not great about the triangulation tables. It's not protected from heterogeneity problems. There's a lot of author choice in how to split the samples. The real thing you should care about is that main table. Right? If you believe this main table, the triangulation tables are just sort of to help shore up or test specific channels about why this is happening. But if you don't believe this main table, you don't believe the paper. Let's go to the conclusion now. So, because I've gone very long now. So Pedersen uses a natural experiment to test if distressed firms risk shift, specifically pension risk shifting. He finds a null result, which is pretty unusual, and I really like that the paper was published in a good journal, despite the null result. So this is some evidence that firms do not risk shift. Why? Well, some evidence is showing up that it's not because of agency conflicts. It's not because the CEO doesn't want to do it. It's not because of corporate governance issues. Maybe it's because of specific pension underfunding rules. There's a lot of regulations involving restricting what companies can do in terms of underfunding. So maybe that's why they don't do it here and they would do it somewhere else. Maybe there's other constraints from stakeholders that he wasn't able to measure in his triangulation tables, and that's why. Of course, it could always be that risk shifting theory is wrong or just doesn't actually happen because everyone who's potentially harmed by it recognizes the problem and restrains these shareholders. So, still an open question, and there's potential for future research. And that is our paper for this week. And stay tuned next Saturday for our next paper, where we'll be looking at tax policy.